Hello, everybody. It's Professor Parish, and welcome to our discussion of poetry. So, after many weeks, we finally bid fiction and nonfiction and all types of prose a fair adieu for now, until we come back to paper 4, which will be several weeks from now. So, instead, we are going to start our poetry unit. Now, based on our first week discussion forum, most of you said that you were least looking forward to poetry, or that it was your least favorite genre. Now, some of you did say you liked poetry. Yay. But others said you're like, oh, I don't like poetry. It's not my favorite. And I would posit, why is that? Usually poetry is the least liked genre of literature for several reasons. One, because there's not really a concrete meaning behind every poem. With a story, you can pretty much identify all the elements of fiction or nonfiction. You can identify the characters, the theme. There may be a few questionable areas, such as with style and symbolism, but for the most part, every story has a discernible theme that you can pick out and identify. With poetry, that's not necessarily the case. Poetry can very much have multiple themes, or it could be left ambiguous. It could be made to where each reader gets something different from the poem. And for a lot of readers, that's frustrating, because I think we as humans, we want something concrete in front of us. And when people are like, oh, it's whatever you interpret it as, then we question whether or not we're right. So not only that, but poetry is also complex. It uses complex emotions, vocabulary, very vague and abstract thoughts at times, descriptions that require a lot of thought and critical thinking. It's not basically a summer read you can just sit there and, get through in an hour. Poetry takes time and effort. And not only that, but it's also sometimes designed to specifically be vague, that we have to sit and derive our own meaning out of. And for some people, that's not their cup of tea. So I posit that this unit on poetry, I'm not guaranteeing I will make you a fan of poetry, but my goal is to at least increase your appreciation. Now, our book has a ton of poetry. I mean, a lot. And some of it is really, really good. There are some poems in our textbook that I feel are a little dated, so I'm going to be bringing in some new poetry, some kind of more modern, up-to-date poetry, perhaps, to show you guys, and I'm pretty excited about that. So, with that being said, we're going to dive right into our poetry unit. Now, on your course homepage, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys. As I scroll down, in week 6, you will see paper 2 guidelines, which I'm going to bring up here in a second. And you also see the poetry presentation part 1. Now, I am going to actually put this presentation in each week of our poetry unit that we use it. You can see here that this video specifically is only going to go over slides 1 through 7, because we're only talking about chapter 12 today, and that is our poetry preview chapter. So we're not going to get through the whole PowerPoint today. We're going to finish up part 1 in week 7, so just keep that in mind. But we are going to look at that, and also let's go ahead and pull up paper 2 guidelines and check those out. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in here to show you guys. Paper 2 is a little bit different than the papers that we will do otherwise in this class. For a lot of students, the paper 2 paper can be either one of the easier papers or one of the harder papers, depending on your preference. So I've tried to, like with our fiction paper, create 3 options that you guys can choose from, and we're going to go over those here. So option 1, let me kind of make this a little bit bigger. Zoom out, made it too big. Okay, option 1 is you can choose, this is the most straightforward option. You can choose 2 poems from our textbook, and basically you will compare and contrast them. So you'll tell how these poems are similar, and the terms from our textbook, you're going to use that to describe these 2 poems, how they're similar, how they're different, and then at the end of all 3 of these options, you are going to create at least 1 short poem of your own. So don't worry, just like with our fiction paper, This is not a creative writing class, so I'm not grading you on creative writing. Instead, for option 1, what I want to see in the very short poem that you create, which is only half a page, you can format it however you like, I want to see that you imitate at least one of the authors, one of the poets that you talk about. So if you compare Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven with Emily Dickinson's The Fly, I can't think of the name of that poem. My mind has gone blank, but Emily Dickinson, if you compare her poem to Edgar Allan Poe's, then the poem that you create needs to imitate at least one of those two poets, and that's entirely up to you. But this is the most straightforward version, the straightforward option for paper 2, but you can do that. Compare and contrast 2 poems from our textbook, or if you have your own poetry books at home, you can select 2 poems from those books as well. Just let me know what those books are, and we'll talk about citations below here in a second. Option 2 is the more creative writing option, and that's where you actually pick 2 pictures that you've taken yourself or that you find on the internet, and you basically create 2 short poems that go with those images. So in our textbook, we'll actually be doing assignments involving the glossy pages of our book, and those are images with poems together. So option 2 is kind of like that. You would pick 2 images out of your own, or if you don't take photos, you can always go online and find 2 pictures. Then you will create 2 poems, one that goes with each picture, and then instead of, you'll basically compare and contrast your poems and talk about how you created them. What terms from our textbook did you use? What was the style? What's the pattern, the format? You're basically kind of critiquing yourself and explaining how you created those poems. So that's option 2. And I actually have a lot of people, hold on, I gotta plug my computer back in. I actually have a lot of students choose option 2 because they like creative writing and they like to use their own photos. Plus, if you use your own photos, you technically own that property, so you don't have to cite your own photos. If you get a picture off of Google, you do have to cite that on a works cited page. So just keep that in mind. And then finally, option 3. Option 3 is kind of like option 1, except instead of 2 poems from our book, you are citing 2 songs. So this is your chance to kind of evaluate music. Oh, hello. My dog, Huckleberry, and I will show you all him. Say hello, Huckleberry. That's him. He's down there with me. So if you hear him bark, that's him. But you get to actually compare and contrast 2 songs instead of 2 poems from our book. So if you like music, this would be your chance to compare and contrast lyrics, mood, tone, pattern, you know, talk about lyrics versus ballads, things like that. You can compare Stairway to Heaven to Freebird. Wouldn't that be fun? So that option is available too. So those are your 3 options. You can compare and contrast 2 poems from our book and then create a poem where you imitate at least one of those poets. Option 2, you write 2 poems of your own that go along with 2 photos, and then talk about how you wrote each of those poems, the terms that you use, the poetry elements present in both poems, etc., etc. Or finally, you compare and contrast 2 songs, and then you will create a little half-page sample of a few verses based on one of those poets, one of those songwriters. Okay? And if you guys have questions about your options here, feel free to email me. I am definitely going to be looking at your thesis statements, your outlines, and answering questions as you guys write those. But as far as formatting goes, your poems that you create have to be at least half a page. Now that's not in giant paragraph forms. You can organize and format these poems however you like. You have total free reign on how to organize your own poems. They just have to fit at least half a page. Your analyses for each option, so your compare and contrast in option 1 and option 3, or your discussion of how you wrote your poems in option 2, that has to be 2 pages. So theoretically, this paper is shorter than the other papers we'll do in the class. There's just a few extra things that go with it, like creating the little poem, doing your analysis. If you choose option 2, you have to choose and show your images, things like that. As always, the font spacing and margins, those are all the same except with your poems. You can be as creative as you want with those. And I'll post a couple examples of paper 2, especially since we've seen so many different kinds of them before, just so you guys have some ideas of what to do. And then, as always, grammar I'm going to look at, spelling. Now, there is a works cited for this paper. It's our first dive into creating a works cited. You don't have to do any in-text citations for this paper. However, I do want to see a works cited page with at least your textbook cited for all 3 options. Options 1 through 3, you should have an MLA page that cites your textbook. If you choose an option 2 to get 2 pictures off of the internet, then you need to cite where those images came from on your works cited page along with your textbook. In options 1, if you did not choose poems from your textbook, if you chose them from the internet, you need to cite those sources. And in option 3, if you chose 2 songs from a website, you need to cite those. So just keep that in mind, all right? And then, of course, all components have to be turned in online on time for full credit. Now, this week, in week 5, your paper 1 drafts were due. As I'm grading those, you do get a chance with papers 1, 2, and 3 to revise those. So if you are not happy with your grade on paper 1, you will get a chance to revise it and turn in the revision copy the same week that paper 2 is due. So if you get paper 1 back and let's say you got a C on it and you're like, oh, I just need to correct the grammar. You correct the grammar, you can email that back to me. As long as you email it back to me by week 8, you're fine. All right? So just keep that in mind. All due dates have to be on time for full credit. No late submissions. So please keep this in mind. Your thesis statement is going to be due September 23rd for paper 2. The outline is due September 30th. And you are getting a little extra time on paper 2, the final draft. It is not due till October 14th. So you'll have all of Columbus Day weekend to work on your paper 2, and you'll have some extra time as well. So just keep that in mind. And then, as always, you can ask me questions. As far as how the paper is broken down, your introduction and conclusion are going to get points. The elements described. This means that you are describing elements of poetry. So if you just explain, let's say you pick option 2, and you create your 2 poems, you have your 2 images. If your analysis just says, oh, here's what these pictures mean to me, that's not enough. You need to actually talk about terms from our poetry chapter, and that will get you points. Creativity and effort, again, if it looks like you've just tried with these poems, that you've made a conscious effort, this will be an easy 20 points to get. Very rarely does a student not get the 20 points. The only way a student has not received this point value is if they didn't create a poem for their paper. And then grammar and spelling, and the page length and formatting. So again, it's like out of 100 points as our other paper was, but just the points are distributed in a different format. So please feel free to ask questions. I know I kind of skimmed over paper 2 guidelines. They are on our handouts for week 6. Please read them, go over them, email me if you have questions, anything at all, and I'm happy to answer them. All right. So with that being said, we are going to dive right in to our discussion of poetry. All right, so this PowerPoint is over chapters 12 through 15. We are only going over chapter 12 in this video, and then in the video for week 7, we'll be going over chapters 13, 14, and 15. So chapter 12, though, does have a pretty big breakdown. So even though we're only going over a few slides, there's a lot to unpack here for the first chapter on poetry. Our chapter starts on page 609. So we skipped chapters 9 and 10 and 11 because they were just extra readings in fiction. So if you are really craving to read some more fiction stories, there's a lot. And a lot of different authors are presented, so feel free to skim through those chapters we did skip. See if there's any stories in there that fascinate you. When we get to our final paper of this class, you may choose to go back and look at those chapters, but there weren't any terms that we needed to go over in those. So on page 611, again, I told you in some of the last videos, I love the photos they choose to headline these chapters. And of course, as a girl of the 90s and a basketball fan, I was a huge Chicago Bulls fan. And there's Michael Jordan, my man. So I ask all my students in English 122, when we have this class face-to-face, I always ask them, why would this textbook choose, start my computer up here. Why would they choose Michael Jordan as the representation of poetry? What does basketball and Michael Jordan have anything to do with poetry? And you get a lot of different answers, so I'd like you to think on that for a moment, why that would be. And perhaps you're thinking the same thing I am, but why? Why Michael Jordan? Why him? Why not anybody else? If you're a fan of basketball, or if you grew up in the 90s, as I did, then you will know that Michael Jordan was constantly on television as kind of the face of basketball. He's sort of like what we akin LeBron James, Stephen Curry, Kobe Bryant, who came after Michael Jordan but was still a little bit ago. Stephen Curry and LeBron James, I would argue, are probably our two biggest similar figures to Michael Jordan. They represent basketball at their best. They're athletes. They're very good and successful athletes. And they represent what's best about the sport in different ways. Michael Jordan was a big part of that in the 90s. He was basically considered one of the best in basketball. And essentially, that's what poetry is. Poetry is defined by our book on page 612, and I love this definition, as language at its best. There's a lot of bad poetry out there. I've written bad poetry in creative writing classes, and you probably have too, perhaps. Or maybe you're an awesome poet, and if so, congratulations. But there's a lot of bad poetry out there, just like there's bad fiction, bad nonfiction, bad drama. But the good poetry is language at its best. It uses the right vocabulary, the right amount of words, the right tone, the right symbolism. Everything has to be chosen perfectly for a poem. You can fluff a story in fiction or nonfiction. You can add a lot of extra junk to it to fill space. But with a poem, you don't really fill space. Everything has to be concisely chosen for the right reason. And that's one of the ways that it's different than other forms and genres of literature that we encounter in this class. So like I have here, poetry is different from other genres in literature, that it comes from a very confusing flow of experience. The experiences discussed in poetry are not normal like they are in fiction. They can come from a variety of different experiences. They can be, from one moment in time. A whole poem can represent a second of time. And that's crazy to think about, because with a story, like a prose, fiction, or nonfiction story, everything's moving so fast in the story. Even if you take a paragraph to describe something, you're still moving and progressing along in time. With poetry, you could have an entire ballad, a long poem dedicated to 1 second in time, and that's it. The story doesn't move any further. There's no linear progression in time in a poem. It can be a second described, and then you move on. And that frustrates some people. Two, it doesn't just give facts or data. Poetry is all about emotion. It's about describing what someone feels or thinks in that exact second or moment. So we aren't presented with information necessarily. We're just presented with an emotional experience. And finally, it's printed as lines of verse. It's not in paragraph format unless it's free form, which we'll talk about shortly. But it's printed specifically in a certain format. All right? So it's a different reading experience than fiction, and we're going to talk about that in this video, how to experience poetry successfully. Oh, I know. Hold on, I've got to throw this dog toy, and I'll be right back. Okay. My dog is asking me to play with him, so if I have to play with him through this video, I apologize. So, poetry terminology. Our book has a lot of it. We're going to start with the basic two types of poems. There is the epic and the lyric. An epic is a word that we have thrown around quite a lot in our generation. But in terms of poetry, an epic is a long poem that has a very elongated and creative, elevated style. So think of Beowulf. If you read Beowulf in high school, Beowulf is actually a poem. It doesn't seem like a poem because what we read is the English translation. And when you translate Beowulf into English, a lot of the rhyming and rhythm and meter, which we'll talk about in this unit, is lost because of translation. So when we read it, it actually seems like it's prose, but in reality, Beowulf is in fact verse. It's in fact poetry, and it would be considered an epic because it's a long poem, it tells a story, it has characters, it's about as close to a fiction or nonfiction piece as poetry can get. Whereas a lyric is what we often consider to be songs in modern day. Lyrics are short poems. So if you hear a song on the radio, that's a short poem. If it's 3 to 5 minutes, that's a lyric. It's just a short poem with repetition, with verses, with meter, with rhythm, but it's not as elevated or elongated as an epic is. An extended metaphor, we've talked about metaphor in fiction, which we all know metaphors are comparing two things or more without using like or as. An extended metaphor we see oftentimes in poetry, and that's just a comparison that extends throughout the entire poem. So perhaps the phrase, she's the wind, her mind is the wind, her mind is a tornado or something like that. The entire poem would focus on that phrase instead of it just being mentioned once in a story and then moving on. Rhyme, that's probably what we associate most in terms of terminology with poetry. A rhyme on page 624 is just an echo effect that is produced when a poet repeats the same sounds at the end of syllables. I will gladly show you the toy that my dog is messing with here in a minute. So oftentimes we consider rhyme to be a necessary thing with poetry, and that's not the case. Poems do not have to rhyme. Now, I'm kind of a more traditional poetry reader in that I really like rhyming in my poems. I like my poems to rhyme. Some people are okay with it not rhyming, but me, I really would like it to rhyme. And we're going to watch a little clip here shortly of someone else who shares my view of things that need to rhyme. And then finally we have stanza. And stanza is similar to verse. It's just a set of related lines in a poem. So I have down here to look at the poem on page 625. And you guys can see at the top of 625 the snail, Cowper's poem there. You guys can see that. And then out to the side beside that poem on page 625, you guys see where it says A, B, A, B, C, C. That is the rhyme pattern. So I'm going to read this poem to you guys. I obviously am not the poet, so I don't know exactly all the inflections and where to make them, but I want you to listen to how this poem is constructed, because there is a method to the madness in terms of how the poet constructed this verse. So the poem goes as follows. Fear no more the heat of the sun, nor the furious winter's rages. Thou thy worldly task hast done, home art gone, and taken thy wages. Golden lads and girls all must, as chimney sweepers, come to dust. So, it's kind of a morbid poem, but you guys can see at the end of each of those lines how the rhyme scheme is working. So, sun, when we write a poem, sun starts out, we start at the top of the alphabet, so sun is A, and sun and done rhyme, so that's A and A. I know. And then rages and wages are B and B, and then at the end of the stanza we have must and dust. So that is where our poem ends its rhymes. Give me this. Okay, so to show you all watching this video, this is what my dog is wanting me to throw. This holiday Christmas pig, so. Alright, so that's stanza. Alright, so, my favorite slide here. Discussing meter, feet, and iambic feet on page 626. When we think of poetry, whenever you read a poem or you watch somebody read, a poem that they've wrote, they have their own rhythm that they create with it. And with that rhythm, with this rhythm, it's kind of almost seems natural, like it's intentional, it just flows off the tongue. That is meter. Meter is that free-flowing rhythm that we kind of speak. If you're on the speech team or if you've ever done public speaking, you'll probably notice when you listen to a speech that each speaker has their own meter. They have their own rhythm of ups and downs in the way that they talk. So if you're really wanting to inflect something, you'll raise your voice up really high. And then if you're wanting to be serious, you'll drop the words down low. That's kind of like a meter. It's just a rhythm and a pattern that you get into. And this elephant is going to be the doom of our class. So that's meter. A foot has to do with meter in that it is a two-part segment in a line of poetry. And the feet of a line of poetry is what helps to create the meter. So you hear iambic, that term used a lot in poetry. That is when you stress the last syllable in a foot. So you have 2 feet. 2 feet that go 2 feet in a row in a poem. And iambic is when you stress the last word in the poem. So on page 266, you guys can see the example here of the Frost poem, Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening. You guys can see towards the middle of the page the example of poetry that is listed there. And I'm going to read this poetry section, and I want you guys to pay attention to how I read it, because the way that it's written, if you take time and read it slowly, you will start to notice something. So read along with me if you can. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. You may not have noticed it, but Frost is using iambic feet in this poem to create a meter. And what he's doing is each line in this verse has pairs of feet. So, whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. So there's pairs of feet throughout the entire verse, just pair after pair of little 2-syllable segments. And if you read this segment out loud like I did, you'll notice that your voice naturally wants to stress the last syllable. So whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. So there's a natural urge to add that stress on that second syllable. And you may be asking yourself, well, that's kind of cool. That's neat that he strategically formatted it that way, but why? Why would he want to have all this iambic feet throughout this verse? What's the point? Well, in Robert Frost's poem, he's on horseback. So he's riding through the woods on this horse. And when you think about it, I'm going to get a little Monty Python here, if you've seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But in Monty Python, they use coconuts to emphasize, hold on, did I get this dog toy? Okay. Alright, so I had to go back and get my dog to get out of the picture for a moment so I could talk more about meter and foot. So, but anyway, just like in Monty Python, they bang those 2 coconuts together to make the sound of horses clopping through the mud. It's like da-da, 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 da-da. It's like a horse walking through snow. That's what Frost is doing. He's using iambic feet to create a meter where it sounds almost like a horse trotting through snow as he gives the poem. So it's kind of cool. You know, it takes a lot of creative effort to make rhymes and patterns in poetry. And, you know, Frost some people may say he's like overrated, but I really admire the fact that he could construct poetry in a way that made you almost hear certain sounds as you read the poem. I think that's really cool. So a more modern example of this meter, this flow, we can see through, and I know my little box here cuts off, Nelly, the St. Louis rapper, has a very specific meter, and I'm going to show you all through this very short segment that I've pulled up here. There is this music critic. He graduated with a degree in music theory. He creates YouTube videos. He's called Todd in the Shadows. I really like him. His gimmick is that he's constantly backlit so you can never see his face, but he reviews music, and he talks a lot about the structure of music and how it's formatted. So we're going to kind of look at 2 short clips from his videos today for this presentation. The first, this actually comes from him reviewing a Florida Georgia Line song. He is, by the way, not a fan of Florida Georgia Line, but it's from his review of the Cruise video. So he's going to talk briefly about why Florida Georgia Line, the country group, wanted to collaborate with Nelly, and he's going to talk about Nelly's flow, or his use of meter. So that's why I'm going to show you guys this clip here. All right, so we're going to jump right into the middle of this video to look at this clip.
Why did it take these 2 genres so long to get together? Now, being of the newer American Eagle-wearing breed of country singers, Florida Georgia Line are openly fans of hip-hop. They even have one of their songs spell "it's" with a Z. That's still cool, right? Was it ever? But anyway, the remix was actually Nelly's idea.
Yo, I was checking out the Cruise video, man. Yeah, that thing the deal, boy. I think we need to turn it up, though. What you think?
Both Florida and Georgia there say they were super psyched about it because they've been listening to Nelly since they were kids. Because, holy crap, Country Grammar came out 13 years ago and they would have been in middle school, and Nelly is almost 40, and I found a gray hair in the mirror the other day, and... Anyway, why did Nelly pick this song to guest on? Well, like I said, the subject matter fits, but also, have you ever listened to Nelly's flow? That sing-songy thing he does? Yeah, if you listen, it's just 2 notes. 2 notes, a fourth apart, like this. Da 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 da. And Cruise? When I first saw that bikini top on her, she's popping right out of the South Georgia water. Da 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 da. 2 notes, perfect for Nelly.
So yeah, that's why I wanted to show you guys that video when he talks about Nelly's flow through his song. That's his use of meter. So rap artists, rap stands for rhythm and poetry. So there is definitely, with each rapper, with each music artist, there's a way that they sing and a cadence that they use that, you know, we can identify as meter, iambic, feet, various terms, not terminology in poetry. But I just want to show you guys his video to kind of explain how even modern artists use that as well. Okay. And then we're going to watch another section of Todd's video here. Half and slant rhymes. Half rhymes and slant rhymes basically mean the same thing. They are pairs of words that they don't rhyme, but they sound similar. And I'm a little bit more forgiving than our video critique Todd is. I'm okay with half rhymes and slant rhymes. I get why they're used. If it's a creative use of them, I think that's perfectly fine. And we have a lot of poetry that we'll look at in this book and that we'll see online that uses a lot of half rhymes and slant rhymes. I did want to show you Todd's video though because it's pretty funny, and his view of half rhymes and slant rhymes is pretty great. So again, if you've not noticed from the last clip, Todd in the Shadows is extremely sarcastic, so you'll have to bear that in mind. But this is basically him evaluating half rhymes that are in current or modern songs.
As I mentioned in the last review, I am, at best, partially about that bass. But let's say that I am. Future husband could be anyone. Let's assume it's me. Maybe you're into broke, jobless guys who spend most of their day watching pirated episodes of Adventure Time. I'm your future husband. It's funny, because I have no future. Well, anyway, what do I need to know?
Take me on a date, I deserve a date, and don't forget the flowers every anniversary.
Oh good, our rhyme button still works. I'm sorry, you were saying? These two kids are so devoid of artistic merit that, this is true, no one has even bothered to give them a Wikipedia page. Wikipedia has a 2,000-word article about mountains that look like boobs. Yet nothing for the rappers behind one of the most popular songs in the country.
And I'm a Detroit baby and I don't know nothing else besides drinking and having parties and having some fun. I say look in the mirror, what you expect me to do? I see a 300S and got the blacked out rim. I take pictures while you do your dance. I can make you famous on Instagram.
And isn't that every girl's dream? To have a photo of their butt go viral?
Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Shake it, shake it, girl. Just a little bit of.
So, yeah, as you can see in the video, that music critic takes a lot of offense to half rhyme and slant rhymes, but I will say that now that I've watched that video of his, it becomes apparent all the time on the radio. I can be driving and then I'll hear a song and a slant rhyme or a half rhyme will show up and I'll be like, oh, that doesn't rhyme, and it kind of drives you crazy. So now I pass that on to you. Okay, so the next terminology we have is free verse versus open form. Now, this question will be on your exam, and basically the difference between free verse and open form is that free verse follows no rules in poetry. It barely resembles a poem. The opening poem that was starting out our entire chapter on page 609 is technically free verse. It doesn't look like a poem, it just looks like a paragraph. But the difference between a free verse and an actual piece of prose is that free verse is still a poem because it doesn't really tell a story. Free verse usually just is words, it's very stylistic, it can be very abstract. To be quite honest, I'm not a fan of free verse because I feel like it lacks too many elements of poetry. I'm like, well, where's the rhyme? Where's the stanza? Where's the meter? Where's the verse? And free verse doesn't really have that, so it's not my favorite. Now, open form poetry, as the term suggests, still looks like a poem. It's still formatted like a poem, but it does not have to rhyme. It does not have to have a rhythm or pattern. It can just look like a poem, but say anything. So again, these two types of poetry are not my favorite, but there are people that really like them because of how much freedom you have with these forms. And so I do understand why certain people use them, but they're just not my cup of tea. But that's the difference. Open form doesn't have to follow any structure, but looks like a poem. Free verse is free for all. No rules, doesn't have to look like a poem. It can be anything. All right. So our book then talks about how to interact and read poetry. And I think this is pretty important because you have to know how to interact with poetry if you're going to read it, and that will help your appreciation of the subject matter. One, give the poem a close reading. Unlike fiction or nonfiction, the book doesn't ask you to read poems over and over again. However, they do ask that you really pay attention to the language used, to how things are formatted and worded, and you may have to read the poem more than once to really get it. So just be aware of that. Two, get your bearings. Understand who the author is. Before you read The Raven, check up on who Edgar Allan Poe is, what his history is, his background, see when poems were written, see who they're written by, what's their connection to poetry. Robert Frost, for example, writes a lot of nature poetry in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So that could be important to know, because you might be like, well, why is he riding on a horse in the middle of winter? Shouldn't he be in his car? And then you're like, oh, it was the 1800s. Okay. So just keep that in mind. Know your author, read poems more than once, and read them closely. Respond to your poems as a whole. a lot of times poets create poems to generate an emotional reaction, and you really need to read the poem entirely before you make a judgment or an analysis of it to understand it fully. Get into the spirit of the poem. Poets write for specific reasons. Some poets write because it's therapy. Poetry can be very therapeutic, and if you have to get emotions out of your system, poetry can be a great way to do it. So if you read a poem that was clearly written to remove angsty emotions about an ex-girlfriend or ex-boyfriend, understand that. Get into the mindset of how this author's writing, and you might appreciate the poem better because you're like, oh, I can understand where they're coming from. And finally, be ready for a personal response. Poetry is specifically designed to elicit an emotional response from you. Poets want you to care and to react and to feel something when you read their poems. So be prepared for that. If you like the poem, be prepared to explain why. And if you don't like the poem, be prepared to also explain why it's not working for you. Because we will look at a lot of poems in this unit, and you will be asked to give a response and basically your critique of that poem. So just be prepared to kind of analyze it and explain how it affects you emotionally as you read. And then finally we have this page. The last two types of poems we're going to talk about today are vignettes and haiku. I will go ahead and tell you that vignettes and haiku are the exact opposite of open form and free verse. There is a specific structure with vignettes and especially haiku. So on page, let me get to these, in our textbook, on page 643, we have some examples of haiku and vignette. And I'll talk about vignette first, even though it's listed second here. Vignettes are just snapshot poetries. They are very short. They are no more than 3 lines. It does not have to have a rhyme scheme. It does not have to have any specific structure except it's just 3 lines. And usually they're just a single, very quick moment. It's almost like if a Facebook status was a poem. That is a vignette. Or if a tweet was a poem. That's a vignette. A haiku, though, has a very, very, very specific format. Haikus, like vignettes, are only 3 lines. However, haikus, each line has to have only a certain number of syllables. And the syllable requirements are 5, 7, and then 5. So line 1 has to have 5 syllables, line 2 has to have 7, line 3 has to have 5. I personally love haikus because I think they're challenging. They force you to choose the correct word for the correct moment and to get the syllable placement right with the word placement. I think it's a fun challenge. I did have a student a few years ago that absolutely hated haikus and told me that the very first time we introduced this unit. They're like, by the way, I hate haiku. And I was like, oh, we're going to be creating a haiku for our final exam, so just so you know. So if you hate haikus, I'm sorry ahead of time. But I've created this little sample haiku here. So whenever you're writing a haiku, just think to yourself, you can count out the syllables as you read. So class is almost done. 5. Can you hear spring calling now? Wish class was over. So just keep that in mind. But that is haikus versus vignettes. And that's it for now. That's slides 1 through 7 in our book. That was chapter 12, the preview chapter. Next week we're going to be going over chapters 13, 14, and 15, which are pattern, image, and metaphor. So fun times. I hope you guys were okay with my dog interrupting the presentation at times. But just give me questions if you guys have any about paper 2, about the thesis statement for paper 2, about paper 1's grading, anything like that, and I'm happy to answer those questions. So I can't believe we're already in week 6. Insanity. So have a great day, a great week, and I will see you guys soon.